Well, staying with the EFF leader, Julius Malema, hitting out at journalists, we now talk to SANEF Executive Director, Kate Skinner, on the issue. Good morning and thank you for joining us.
Good morning.
Now, just give us your take on yesterday's remarks by Julius Malema.
So it's interesting, they're quite contradictory. So, you know, on the one hand, he looks at specific journalists and he singles out particular journalists for attack. But then he also says, you know, we need to be kind of civilized and we need to ensure that there's intellectual debate and we need to kind of rigorously intellectually engage with journalists. So I think it's important to kind of point out that, you know, it's not just a blanket condemning of journalists, but also kind of making kind of warlike sort of comments. Aggressive, but then kind of pulling back and then basically saying, but you know, of course we need to intellectually engage.
And by naming those specific journalists, is this not intimidation tactics?
Yeah, so as SANEF we are very worried about specific journalists being named because what happens then is that it kind of unleashes the followers to then do some serious cyberbullying. So that's the context that kind of ensues.
And then you'd find that, you know, many of his utterances have been, like Tinko said, Ongama said, there's a sectarian and racist narrative that underpins much of his utterances and part of the ethos of the EFF. I mean, we know this goes against nation building, but as far as targeting journalists, you can also see that narrative extending into the journalistic fraternity.
No, absolutely. But you know what I also do think is important to put on the table is that it's not to say that the media is, you know, above criticism. You know, where there are biases, you know, and particular narratives are coming out and others are not, it's important that those, you know, that we have the space for all those narratives to come out. So I think it's important to say that. But you're quite correct to say that, you know, it's very problematic when particular people are being targeted. You know, and also it's interesting because there are various mechanisms that you can go to. So you can go to the Press Council, you can go to BCCSA, you can go to ICASA and lay complaints. You can also directly go to the editors. And exactly. It seems that those particular mechanisms are not being used.
Exactly. So he's highlighting these things and he's actually pointing to certain journalists as being as providing certain kinds of truths that are not in keeping with his personal ideology or the ideology of the EFF.
Yeah.
Is this politicking? Is this now part of the EFF's grandstanding outside Praveen Gordon's testimony, you know, spending the entire day out there and then making all these wonderful allegations outside? Is this not part of their campaigning?
Of course. Absolutely. This is absolutely part of the campaigning. So I think that things are going to hot up a lot, you know, in terms of the elections. And I think that, you know, lots of people are going to be under attack, including journalists. And I think it's worrying for journalists to be under attack because we need to make sure that they can actually speak, ask the questions, ask many questions from many perspectives so that we can vote in these elections and actually have the information we need.
And then Malema also says he does not want to be interviewed by certain journalists. So he's being picky about who actually chooses, who he chooses to interview him.
Yeah.
How does SANEF handle this?
Yeah, because you see the thing is it's interesting because the EFF has done this previously because they actually said, you know, we're not going to speak to ANN7 journalists. And at that particular point we said, unfortunately, that's not how it should work. You do need to be able to you do need to speak to all the different journalists. And so I think as a media fraternity, we have to come up very strongly saying, you've got to speak to all the journalists. You know, all these political parties have to speak to all the journalists. There needs to be that freedom, that space for freedom of expression and access to information. Sure.
Well, where to from now, from here?
So I think as a body, SANEF as a kind of you know, industry body, what we can do is to put that message out very strongly about the fact that you've got to speak to all the different journalists, all the different media houses, but also just sort of say, you know, obviously, you know, we welcome criticism. Like you come to us, give us criticism, go through the right channels, you know, speak to the editors, rigorously engage with the editors. There isn't a problem with that, but let's go through the right processes.
What recourse do those journalists have now that he's named them and he's, you know, tainted them with a certain brush.
Yeah, I mean, it is dangerous for those journalists, and that's actually something that we're looking into. I mean, in fact, safety of journalists during this election is something that is an absolute priority for SANEF. And you're right, we've actually got to look at how to protect them. But it's difficult because we're now in a kind of anarchic space, which is that social media space, and there are not a lot of rules there. And
that's right.
Yeah.
There's not a lot of gatekeeping going on in that space. Well, thank you very much for joining us.
That's a pleasure.
Thank you very much.